my name's Eric Bird. I'm the Technical Manager at Arrow and Southern Response, and today I'm just going to talk through the AMI policy and how it fits with the MBIE guide. In 2012, following the Christchurch earthquakes, the government, via the Department of Building and Housing back then, which is now the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, or MBIE, put out some guidance in terms of how we go about scoping, repairing and rebuilding houses in all of the various technical category zones in the Port Hills throughout Christchurch. The intent of that was really to ensure that we had a consistent approach to assessing and repairing and rebuilding houses throughout all of Christchurch, so everybody was essentially following the same rule book. There's often a lot of uncertainty around how the AMI policy fits with the MBIE guideline, or whether they even do fit together. So this is really just an explanation of how we think they fit together. It all starts with the AMI policy. This is the AMI main policy that we use. And the first principle here is circled in that red circle, which says your house is covered for any unforeseen and sudden physical loss or damage. So I guess the key principle there being it's actually damage that triggers the insurance policy. The insurance policy won't do anything unless something is damaged. The second principle, point A, we will pay to repair or rebuild your home to an as-new condition. So two key principles there. It's damage that triggers the insurance policy to act, and then once we have damage, we will repair or reinstate it to an as-new condition. And I guess it's the as-new condition that's often the source of a lot of confusion. What does as-new mean? The MBIE guideline actually sets out how we should assess and repair houses. It has a similar philosophy in terms of Section 14 of the MBIE guideline. Says in 14.2, the first step in assessing repair options for a damaged house in TC3 is to make a reasoned judgment on the severity of damage that has occurred to the house structure. So similar principle to the insurance policy in that we're actually responding to damage. We're not starting with the technical category of the site, we're not starting with anything else. We're actually starting with a reasoned judgment on the damage that's occurred to the house, because that's what we need to respond to, so we fix the damage. I guess the next question is, well, how do we make that reasoned judgment? How is that consistently applied? To make that reasoned judgment on the severity of damage that's occurred to the house, we again apply the MBIE guidelines. That sets out what we need to do in terms of assessing the damage that's occurred, and that's covered generally in Section 2 of the MBIE guidelines. One of the key criteria is how level the floor is. I guess if you think about the reason we're rebuilding a lot of houses on the flat, or repairing a lot of houses on the flat in Christchurch, is because liquefaction occurred. The house foundations weren't designed for liquefaction damage, so the temporary loss of support resulted in the foundations settling differentially. So one of the key indicator criteria is how level the foundations are. So as part of the assessment process, someone will conduct an assessment of floor levels in the house, and that's specifically what this table here from the MBIE guidelines illustrates. But I guess coming back to the key concept in the AMI policy, the AMI policy says you're covered for any damage. So it's not any damage over a certain threshold, it's just any damage. So in column 2 of table 2.3, one of the key numbers there is 50 millimetres, and the MBIE guideline would suggest that with less than 50 millimetres of differential settlement, it's not structurally significant, therefore you don't need to do anything in most cases. However, the AMI policy would say in that situation, you've got some settlement that if you can clearly demonstrate is earthquake damage, the AMI policy says we are obligated to fix that 50 millimetres or less to an as-new standard. So the AMI policy in some situations actually goes beyond what the MBIE guidelines would suggest. Once you've done that reasoned assessment outlined in the MBIE guidelines, the MBIE guidelines also provide us with an overview in terms of some decision trees about how you go about assessing repair options and what technical inputs you might require. So here's an example just of a flow chart that engineers in Canterbury would work through in order to come up with the repair methodology for a house. And I guess the intention there is to standardise the way that people repair houses, to make sure that people aren't doing it differently depending on who the engineer is. So I guess just reiterating, the AMI policy responds to damage, not damage over a certain threshold, just any damage. The MBIE guidelines provides us with the framework to assess that damage and some methodologies to try and figure out what the actual repair methods should be. Coming out of the methodologies that we'd worked through from the MBIE guidelines, the AMI policy says that we should repair to an as-new standard. So what does that mean? Well, there's a definition on the Southern Response website of what we interpret as new to mean. And the key point I wanted to highlight here was ultimately it's the function of the element that is considered when we're considering as new. So in this case, I'm primarily talking about foundations. Foundations have a structural function, primarily a structural function, in lots of cases only a structural function. I guess if you think about it in terms of some other things, like the jib finish on your wall, its function is aesthetic. It needs to look nice. We can't just glue up a crack and leave it as is, because the function of that element is actually aesthetics. However, a foundation, the primary function of a foundation is to hold the house off the ground. So therefore, it's the structural function of that element that we consider when we think about as new. So when we think about a structural repair on a foundation, what does as new mean? Generally, a foundation was constructed to the current code at the time, so as long as the repair that we do complies with the building code, which is what the MBIE guidelines provides us with, which is a means of compliance with the building code, then we should also be complying with that as new test. In the case of repairing the structural elements of foundations, repairing it to code via the MBIE guidelines is the same as repairing it to as new in the AMI policy. However, like I mentioned before, some of the thresholds might be tighter, so we don't have an obligation just to get it back to just under those MBIE thresholds, like 49 millimetres. We actually have an obligation to get it back to approximately where it was as new. Obviously taking into account real life factors such as how level kitchens were to begin with and how square doors and windows were. We don't want to try and get it back to 0 millimetres and then discover that we've actually caused a whole bunch of other damage in doing so. So in conclusion, it's earthquake damage that triggers the AMI policy. If we can demonstrate there is earthquake damage, or if you can demonstrate there's earthquake damage, the AMI policy is activated. The MBIE guidelines provide us with the framework to assess the damage and the methodologies to repair that damage that comply with the code. However, we repair damage to an as-new standard, which, as I've said previously, sometimes it actually requires us to go to a slightly higher standard than suggested in the MBIE guidelines. And in this case, because as new actually relates to the function of the element, which are, in this case, foundations, it's a structural consideration that we make. The MBIE guideline response is generally the same as the AMI policy response. However, like I said before, the policy may dictate tighter targets. A couple of examples to explain this and how this works together in a real life situation so that you can see the actual practical implications is around re-levelling foundations. So here is a concrete perimeter foundation that has settled as a result of liquefaction. We are putting a concrete pad in underneath and then lifting the foundation to re-level it. When that foundation was brand new, it didn't have a concrete pad there. However, it does now as part of the re-levelling process. So that re-level complies with the MBIE guidelines and therefore it complies with the code. And in these circumstances, it meets the as new test because it doesn't have an aesthetic function. So another example of how the MBIE guideline and the AMI policy work together is considering how we go about re-levelling timber floors. So in some cases the floor has settled because the foundations have settled, so we can re-level the floor by lifting off the top of the foundation in order to re-level the floor. Basically, we mechanically lift the floor and then the gaps form between the floor and the pile that we pack with a suitable packer. That retains the structural integrity of the foundation. It continues to perform to the same extent that it did prior to the earthquakes, and it complies with the building code. So in that case, that methodology meets the as new test. Another example of how the two work together is repairing cracks in concrete slabs. So ultimately the function of a concrete slab is to form your floor. It'll be covered by something like carpet, so therefore the actual slab itself doesn't have any aesthetic function, which then enables us to repair a crack as long as it makes sure that the concrete slab retains its structural integrity. So here's a picture of a slab that was cracked as a result of the earthquakes. The engineer has added some additional reinforcing and epoxied up that slab, which has meant that that slab will now continue to behave structurally the same way that it did before the earthquake. In some cases where you've got an element that might have more than one function, for example a polished concrete floor or a polished room roof floor, that would change our repair methodology because we'd need to make sure whatever repair methodology we used kept that element looking the same as it did before. So in that case there would be two considerations, both the structural and the aesthetic consideration. So a good analogy is having a small prang in your car. The insurer will look at the damage that's occurred to the car figure out whether it's more economic to actually repair the damage in the panel or replace the panel as a whole. And I guess that's similar to what we do with the house. We have a look at the damage that's occurred and figure out whether it's more viable to repair that particular element or whether we should just replace it entirely. So that was a quick summary of the way that we think the AMI policy and the MB guideline work together. You can find the relevant documents either on the Southern Response website or on the MB website.